Well, Module 5 already. This week, our course asks you to kind of step back and take in the big picture, to start thinking in terms of the context that we know literature that we know literature through, and that we know authors through. In a large way, this simply means talking about writing and writers in conjunction with movements in history and movements in literature. For reading, what you're asked to accomplish is essentially a complete digestion of our textbook by Gray. Now, that probably seems a little ambitious, and I agree. Way back when, a month ago, in my initial observations, I gave some of my thoughts on the way graduate school tosses huge heaps of textual information at a student. The long and short of it is that we, by which I mean me as your professor and the professional course designers who've put together Lit502, are quite aware that no one can do justice to the amount of information Gray provides in just a single going over, not over the course of just a couple of weeks. In fact, our module overview points to the truth of the matter when it says that while it would be beneficial to get the widest perspective on American literature possible, what is practically needed is for you to focus on the perspectives which are, at this instant, applicable to you and your milestone project. And really, don't think of this as a bait and switch of asking you to do one thing while really seeking another result. It's actually setting up a model that I think every scholar follows. This is really the way we work. For instance, a great book that I heartily recommend is Antinomies of Realism from 2013 by the master critic Frederick Jameson. And I'm not lying, it's good. It's actually readable and everything. With that said, when I pick up Jameson's book, what I invariably do is sit and pick it apart to see how it sits with my preconceptions of how realism and naturalism fit together in American literature. Because it's in my area of specialization, I come at it with a thesis in mind, meaning, how I understand what naturalism is, and that presents a sort of thesis for me, and I use it as a measuring stick when I deal with that text. I look for how what Jameson says can be read to support my beliefs, or I look for spaces where I need to argue with Jameson or adjust my own ideas if I find his points compelling. Now, my point in this is simply I do enjoy the criticism, but I also want to get my full use of it, so I can't help but fall into how it can be useful to me, to my work. You should do likewise with our text by Gray. Now, a fairly important consideration this week is not only history as it relates to literature, but history as it relates to authors, how their contexts shaped them, informed them, and compelled them to write what they wrote. And I wanted to take a minute to ask you to think about that. It may seem rather obvious to you that this is a useful thing to do, but for much of the 20th century, it simply wasn't taught that way. I'm old enough that when I was an undergraduate, I was taught by professors who learned their craft from the school of the new critics who dominated literature during the 20th century. These were guys who swore that the text itself was the only thing that mattered, that if the data was not conveyed to the reader through the words included in the poem or the novel, then it could not be considered germane to the text. This literally means that exploring the history and culture in which an author lived was discounted by these critics as being inconsequential except where it was overtly, undeniably depicted in the writing. So I really just want to note what a shift has occurred in the short space of my life on what we think is important in talking about literature. Over the past 40 years, a major transition has occurred, which puts culture in the forefront of how we think about what literature is doing. And this, in turn, is part of a long arc of thinking about the significance of culture as a concept since, really, the Age of Enlightenment. One quick aside on my characterization of what the new critics said versus what they did. I'm pretty accurate in my summary of how they revered the text, establishing a hierarchy placing it above the author. With that said, if you pick up A Well-Wrought Urn from 1947, and that's Essays by Cleanth Brooks, one of the most important new critics, you'll find that probably about half of what he says about poets like John Donne, Wordsworth, and Eliot, relates to biography for these authors. The truth is, like everyone, the new critics were products of their training, and while they prioritized the text over supplemental data about the author, they could not really just let it go because they had been schooled as scholars to revere such data as part of the fullness of the picture. Practically, however, that was not the case for me as a student who was trained under the auspices of what they said was important to do. Priority in my classes back then was given to being able to parse and twist a text through spot reading and providing original, instantaneous interpretation. It was fun, but it was a really fragmented way of approaching literature. Now, this week, we have a discussion asking for you to think in the big pictures about literary trends and movements, and at the end of the week, I'm looking to see an annotated bibliography for your milestone project. Consider this an alarm. If you have not begun researching in earnest, this is the time to get to it. Start looking at sources and start formulating how they can fit into your viewpoint, your argument. And that's exactly what I was talking about doing with Gray. So you're going to want to do that with your other secondary sources as well. All right? So if you have questions, concerns, you know how to get a hold of me. Do so. All right? Till next time.